Hello and welcome to another episode of Terribly Drawn History. Today we are going to be discussing the centralization of European states. Prior to the formation of powerful central rule, states were shell countries, consisting of many powerful nobles struggling for power, with a weak king at the helm. This defines the period known as the Middle Ages, roughly from 500 AD to 1500 AD. According to a popular theory debated among the historical community, there was a revolution in the way war was waged that had a lasting impact on the structure of states. Today we are going to be discussing the different aspects of the so-called revolutions and see how this would ultimately lead to the centralized absolute monarchies of the early modern period. The arrival of gunpowder in Europe is around when this revolution would take place. Although the new invention would not see widespread use on its arrival, it is estimated that around the time of the Italian Wars, or the early 16th century, states began to see the true power of firearms. The French would show other nations the power of the cannon when used in mass, while the Spanish would field one of the first ever professional units, the tercio, consisting of a square pike formation surrounded by guns. After these wars, states began to seek new ways to use firearms effectively. The Dutch are credited with being one of the first to drill all their soldiers in the doctrine of volley fire, and European powers were quick to adopt this tactic. For those who do not know what volley fire is, it is simply the precise movement of troops so that one line can fire whilst the other line reloads and continually switch. In order to volley fire or line fight effectively, states would have to opt for a full-time professional army that would be well trained in order to fire as rapidly as possible. Training, supplying, and maintaining a professional army was very expensive, and while many kings could undertake this task with the vast wealth they had at their disposal, many of the feudal lords and barons could not hope to fund such an army. This curtailed the subjects' power, as they were no longer able to field such an army. And if they did, they could only afford untrained peasants and a few hundred knights, who would be easily decimated by the rapid fire of well-drilled linemen. With the new expenses of the army taking a toll on many states, and the discovery of new lands as well as trade routes, there would be a new emphasis on maintaining sea power, or the ability to engage in maritime trade. With the advent of gunpowder, armed boats would make their debut on the high seas. States would have to heavily invest in these new weapons in order to protect their trade routes from pirates and other competing states. This had the same effect that firearms had on land, greatly crippling the economic power of many feudal leaders. It would also have the effect on smaller states, who simply could not compete with the growing demand. The expenses would not stop there, however. With new ways to make better gunpowder and bigger cannons being produced, medieval castles were rendered obsolete, easily being destroyed by besiegers. States, and anyone seeking to have military power, would have to update all of their existing fortification systems, adopting a new style of low bulky walls with angles for crossfire. These new fortifications would be costly, but necessary to the security of the state, so construction of these fortifications were of critical importance. These forts would cripple smaller states, most notably the Republic of Siena, who after spending all of their resources on their fortification systems, had no funds to muster an army. Overall, these changes bolstered the power of the monarchs, who had more income than the local nobility. With the king now having the biggest, baddest army in the state, he was no longer under threat from the aristocracy, and could begin to consolidate absolute power. Kings would go a step further, and be sure that their ascendance to the throne was overseen by a religious official, to confirm that he had divine right. Although this was not a new idea, it would take on more meaning during the religious wars of the early modern period. Now, in order for a noble to fully justify a war against the king, was to risk excommunication from whatever religion they belonged to. Often, these nobility had to convert in order to go to war, and even then they seldom gathered support from their religious minority. These religious motives, coupled with new professional armies, made combat much more brutal. While peasants would almost certainly flee from the battle after sustaining mild damage, these well-trained soldiers stared down volleys of musket fire, fixed bayonets, and charged the enemy, seeking either to destroy the heretics or bring glory to the king, although some were simply fueled by the fear of ostracization, or getting roasted by the squad. These new centralizing states, England, France, Spain, Russia, and many more, would have to formulate a complex bureaucracy in order to maintain all of these different events. The king would now take the most trusted and competent nobility, or those seeking to conform, and make them his administrators, generals, admirals, and other upper-class positions. This changed the nature of Europe, and the way it operated, having a lasting impact to this day. Nationalistic sentiments would begin to rise for the united state, and war would now be seen as a conflict against greatly different peoples. The restraints that might have withheld feuding nobles from completely slaughtering their kinsmen would almost certainly not be carried over. The European powers that successfully centralized used their efficient structure to subdue other peoples on separate continents, who had not undergone the same transformation as they did, and still had structures similar to feudalism. Through this, the major European states were able to conquer most of the world, bringing their new tactics and style of warfare with them, shaping the globe and history as we know it. Ultimately, these drastic changes in the way war was conducted were the catalyst for change in the nature of European states. From a cluster of overmighty subjects swearing allegiance to a king whose reasons to rule are mainly religious-based, and because his army would be an inconvenience for nobles to fight alone, to a powerful divine monarch at the front of a well-trained, well-administered army, and as well as a powerful navy, who had crushed any other aggressor in his territory.
This has been another episode of Terribly Drawn History. Thanks for watching. Love you guys.